Aloha Mai Kako, a Komamita curtain call from a distance, a program of reviews, previews, interviews, and features of and or with the great art and artists on Maui and beyond. I'm Paul James Brown, and I'm coming to you from my home office, where I have been conscientiously practicing self-isolation. Do you remember when you were a kid and you played games? These games had rules, and everyone understood them and abided by them, except for that one kid who looked at the rules and decided they could be bent, interpreted, and changed to his advantage. He would do anything to win, even cheat. Of course, that kid ultimately ended up playing with himself because the rest of the kids didn't want to play the game that way. Unfortunately, today we have a situation that is similar, although the stakes are higher and we can't ostracize the cheaters because many of them are in control. Amazon Prime is showing a film, All In, the fight for democracy, that everyone needs to see. It is a film about systemic racism in this country that we are confronting today like never before. The martyrs to this system go back to the beginning of this country, when the first slave ship arrived, and continue to this day. Their names are all too familiar, and it seems every few days a new name is added. Our so-called leaders deny there is systemic racism here. They tell us they are trying to prevent voter fraud by implementing systems that deny our most basic and cherished freedom, the foundation of democracy, the right to vote. Now we are faced with a pretender who insists the next election, the one less than a month away, will be rigged unless he wins. This film reveals the truth about how those kids that we wouldn't play with because they were cheaters got together and through every means at their disposal have sought to prevent the free exercise of the basis of our democracy, the right to vote. The film starts and ends with the recent race for governor in Georgia between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. But it shows how voter suppression has been a systemic tactic of white supremacists since the founding of this country. In the beginning of this country, only 6% of the population were qualified to vote. We learned that after emancipation and the passage of the 13th Amendment banning slavery, the 14th Amendment in 1868 defining citizenship, which interestingly, the film points out California and Oregon refused to ratify that 14th Amendment because they had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred 100,000 Chinese from citizenship. And finally, the 15th Amendment in 1869, giving Black men the right to vote. Former slaves and free Blacks ran for and were elected to Congress, such as Congressman Josiah Thomas Walls, was a United States congressman who served 3 terms in the U.S. Congress between 1871 and 1876. He was one of the first African Americans in the United States Congress elected during the Reconstruction era and the first Black person to be elected to Congress from Florida. Congressman Benjamin Sterling Turner was an American businessman and politician who served in the United States House of Representatives representing Alabama's 1st Congressional District in the 42nd United States Congress. Congressman Jefferson Long was an American politician from Georgia. He was the 2nd African American sworn into the U.S. House of Representatives and the 1st African American congressman from Georgia. Congressman Robert Carlos DeLarge was a Republican member of the United States House of Representatives from South Carolina, serving from 1871 to 1873. He was earlier a delegate to the 1868 State Constitutional Convention and elected in 1868 to the South Carolina House of Representatives for 1 term. Senator Hiram Rhodes Revels was a Republican U.S. Senator from Mississippi, minister in the African American Methodist Episcopal Church, and a college administrator. Born free in North Carolina, he later lived and worked in Ohio, where he voted before the Civil War, and even the governorship of Louisiana, Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, was an American publisher and politician, a Union Army officer, and the first African American to become governor of a U.S. state. A Republican, Pinchback served as the 24th governor of Louisiana. This incensed white Southerners, most of whom were veterans of the Confederate military. In 1890, Mississippi held a constitutional convention in which its president, S.S. Calhoun, said, quote, "We came here to exclude the Negro. Nothing short of this will answer." They did everything they could to deplete the black voting population by imposing poll taxes to impossible literacy tests. In fact, one of the narrators of the film revealed he gave the test to his second-year law students, and none of them could pass it. And finally, to murder, as an example of what happens to uppity, here they use the N-word, when they exercise their constitutional rights. It delves into the infamous racist D.W. Griffith film based on the novel The Klansman, renamed The Birth of a Nation. The film is blatantly white supremacist from its start. With Election Day, it shows a white actor in blackface voting twice, then intimates that the Negroes and carpetbaggers won a tainted victory. It casts the KKK as the heroes of the film, disarming blacks and saving white women from them. This film also tells the story of a black World War II veteran, Maceo Snipes, who, when he returned home after the war to Taylor County, Georgia, is determined to vote. 3 days later, 4 white men executed him at his home for voting. None of them were convicted of a crime because they pled self-defense. This murder was the impetus for other black people to demand the right to vote. We see the efforts and the results and the direct connection between the police riot at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and President Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William Rehnquist, is revealed as the head of the ballot security for Maricopa County, Arizona, from 1960 to 64, where his job was to suppress Black and Hispanic voters through voter intimidation. Each time disenfranchised people have made strides towards equality through voting, the forces of white supremacy and racism have done their best to repress them. We see that in the famous 2013 case of Shelby County versus Holder, wherein Shelby County challenged the need for a Voting Rights Act since we had a Black president. Obviously, we had reached a place where racism was a moot point. The court, now headed by Chief Justice John Roberts, who before he was appointed to the Supreme Court was mentored by Chief Justice Rehnquist and who was hired to prevent the renewal of the Voting Rights Act. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court overturned the provision of the Voting Rights Act that forced the states who had practiced egregious voting policies against minorities to pre-qualify their electoral procedures. Writing for the minority, the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, quote, "Throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet," unquote. The film focuses on a mini biography of Stacey Abrams. She was the valedictorian of her high school, and as such was invited to attend a reception for all scholars at the governor's home. But when she and her parents arrived, they were turned away by the guard. However, her father convinced the guard to look on the list, and they were finally admitted. Ms. Abrams is shown at the 50th anniversary of the March on Selma in Washington, D.C., where she addressed the throngs. Finally, we see her effort to become governor of Georgia, and it is revealed what the former Secretary of State did to thwart her effort and beat her. The film concludes with a star-studded exhortation to vote. This is a gripping film that has so many revelations in it. It is both a great history lesson, an expose of the current situation in our country, and a call to action to defeat the forces of white supremacy in this coming election by voting. Tune in and see this film. Well, that's Curtain Call from a Distance for this week. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Paul James Brown. Ahui ho.